welcome to this. Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this roundtable. The topic of this roundtable is the justification and objectives of regional policy under new circumstances. I think we can wait 1 minute just to allow people to connect, and then we start. Okay, so 1 minute from now, and we start the session. Okay. So good afternoon, everybody. We are starting this very interesting roundtable. As you know, the topic is justifications and objectives of regional policy under new circumstances, policy, politics, and trade-offs. So this is a very short introduction to the topic of the roundtable, and also to what our distinguished speakers will speak about afterwards. Okay. The topic are the justifications for regional policy, its objectives, and the trade-offs we are facing, but under the new circumstances we're living in. So this is not at all a new issue, it's a very old one, but the current situation requires new and different replies. So in this very short introduction, I will just speak about where do we come from, and then I will leave to our speakers to tell us where do we stand and also where we are headed to. If we look at where we are coming from, we can see 3 waves. The first one, we can call it the disparities wave. Okay, so the eldest wave is one in which the main issue to be addressed by regional policy were disparities. Okay, and disparities, of course, were mostly due to cumulative causation. But at the same time, the main justification for regional policy was market failures. As Stilwell put it, the case for intervention stems from the inadequacy of free market forces. So the idea is that when there is something wrong with the free market, an intervention is needed. And what is interesting at the time is that different types of problem areas were already present. For example, the underdeveloped, which we could call now the lagging, the depressed, which will certainly include today's middle income trap, and the congested, today the advanced but congested region. So the idea is that regional policy was not just for lagging regions, also at a time in which disparities were the main issue. Even more interesting, the fact that the 2 objectives at the same time were equity and efficiency, but 2 other objectives which we are thinking about now, quality of life and environmental protection, were already present, especially in advanced countries, okay, as already noted by Friedman and Alonso almost 15 years ago. So these objectives, of course, we are dealing with them differently today, but they are not new objectives. The second wave, we could call it the competitiveness wave. What happened? There was a wave of liberalism starting in the 1980s, and after that, sustaining regional policy just for the sheer reduction of disparities was not longer feasible. So regional policy had to improve growth and competitiveness. But at the same time, the emergence of the knowledge economy added an important centripetal force, because we all know how centripetal is the knowledge economy. Well, to this, the fact that, as noted by Camagni, there was a lack of automated equilibrating mechanism in the regional economy, so that without interventions or regional competitiveness for lagging regions, they could go into exclusion and decline. However, at the same time, the study of agglomeration, I'm referring here to the new urban theories and the new economic geography, showed that agglomeration could be a stable outcome, but also an efficient one, which means that the trade-off between equity and efficiency was evident and stronger, and especially when agglomeration economies are strong and when regions are structurally different. All these culminated with the well-known World Bank report, which called for space-blind policies. The third wave, we could call it the potential wave. And this is the place-based wave, the one in which the place-based revolution was behind conceptually and practically, and it was the reply to the trade-off. Focusing on the potential of places, in fact, we could have the two objectives of competitiveness and cohesion to be achieved at the same time. In the words of Barca and others, tapping into unused potential in the intermediate and lagging areas can actually enhance both growth at the local and the national level. Practically, this came with policy intervention to provide integrated bundles of public goods and services, aiming at triggering institutional change, improving the well-being of people, and also the productivity of businesses, and promoting innovation. These are the words of the well-known Barca report. So along these lines, there was the strong start of the smart specialization strategies, okay, which, as you know, have the intent of finding opportunities for every region through this entrepreneurial discovery process. Okay, in this way, looking for opportunities for every region, for example, EU cohesion policy, which had smart specialization strategies as a conditionality, okay, would achieve competitiveness and cohesion at the same time, okay? But this was not the end of the story. Why? Because we are facing at least four main challenges for regional policy. The first one is that place-based was certainly helpful, but it was not a panacea, okay? We saw disparities to increase inside most countries after the financial crisis, which also gives rise of a race against the clock, as Jan Marino and others put it, for lagging regions. Moreover, smart specialization strategies appear to be more difficult for lagging regions because their opportunities are lower at the same time, but they also are less equipped to find them. And this also has political implications because there are places which feel left behind and can vote against the system, but even against themselves. Okay, and there are other political questions such as those entailed by the Brexit. And finally, this is not just a matter of lagging regions, because we have regions which are not lagging, but which appear to be trapped into this middle income trap. The second challenge is the one of the global attention to environmental sustainability. Okay, this of course brings to the light green objectives, as we saw in many plenaries in this conference, okay, but also trade-offs, okay, because the impact of climate change in this is different in different regions, and the impact of mitigation measures is also different in different regions, and in many cases it is more problematic for lagging regions. Then there is the issue of technological transformations, okay, for example, Industry 4.0, but also new ways of robotics and automation, and regions are differently equipped to deal with that. Final point, of course, the COVID pandemic, which led to a disruption of global flows, but it also had different sanitary impact, but also different economic impact, so that the many regions are not having the same issues, and they will have different problematics from now on. So the open questions to which this roundtable will try to reply are if politicians or policymakers ask why they should implement regional policy, what would our reply be? So what would we reply to these politicians? So what should be the main justification, objectives, targets of regional policy in the next 10 years? And how can regional policy provide a response to the current challenges? Then, should we promote regional policy for all regions or not? Which trade-offs we can avoid, and which other trade-offs will we inevitably face? Because hiding the trade-offs is not a good strategy. It's better to be aware of that, because otherwise people will lose confidence in our institutions. And finally, are there issues which it is better to leave for the national level? So should we really address everything with regional policy or not? So the speakers of this roundtable are the following one. So there are Dorothy Allen-Dupré from the OECD, Elisa De Propris from the University of Birmingham, Louis Dykstra from the European Commission, Robert Huggins from Cardiff University, and Sami Moizio from Helsinki Institute of Urban and Regional Studies. So just a moment, I want to see. Okay, Dykstra is there. So I think we will follow the following order. So we will start with the presentation by Dorothy Allen-Dupré, and then the one of Louis Dykstra, who are more general presentation addressing more in detail which issues we are facing and going on. And then we will have three presentations which we will focus on aspects which are sometimes little explored but very important for regional policy. So Lisa De Propris will go into the technological and industrial aspects. Robert Huggins will go into the behavioral aspects, which are a very new trend of research in this field. And finally, Sami Moizio will go into the political issues which are behind it. Okay, so I close here my introduction. Okay, and give ground to Dorothy Allen-Dupré. Okay, Dorothy Allen-Dupré is the head of the Regional Development and Multi-Level Governance Division in the Center for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Regions and Cities of the OECD. Okay, in this position, Ms. Allen-Dupré is driving the OECD's Regional Development Policy Committee work. Okay, so she's in a very good observatory to have trends, not just in Europe, but also at a much wider scale. Okay, so floor is yours. Every speaker is supposed to speak about 10 minutes so that we have time for questions from the audience. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Hugo, and thank you for inviting me in this very interesting roundtable. I hope you can hear me well, and I hope you can see the slides. This is a very timely discussion, as many countries and regions are adjusting their regional policy priorities in the wake of the COVID-19 crisis. So let me provide a few insights from an OECD perspective. I will first make general comments on the shift of regional policy objectives over time, and then focus on 5 main reasons for policymakers and why regional policy are more justified than ever in the current context. Okay, I'm trying to change slide and it doesn't. All right. Okay, so first a few remarks on the shift of regional policy objectives over time and the trade-offs. Hugo gave a very comprehensive introduction already, very clear. So you know it well. Regional policy objectives have regularly shifted over time. I mean, if we caricature a bit, we can say that there has been a shift from a focus on lagging regions, equity, redistribution, to a greater focus on efficiency and competitiveness, what Hugo called the competitiveness wave. And then after the 2008 global financial crisis, what we have observed is a more diversified and balanced set of objectives for regional policy, notably with a greater focus, which was already there, but it was greater on environment and well-being. So of course, having these objectives as priorities do not mean that they were successfully implemented. And the gap, on the contrary, has sometimes been growing between the stated objectives and what we have been observing on the ground and the implementation. The spatial focus of regional policy has also shifted from a focus on lagging regions to a focus on all regions and mobilizing the endogenous potential of all regions. So reconciling indeed a bit the equity, efficiency, environmental objectives in all regions. And in many countries, the unit of interventions has also changed with a greater focus on the regional scale to promote economies of scale and exploit urban-rural linkages. So this place-based policy approach is really the approach endorsed and promoted by the OECD Regional Development Policy Committee, very much in line with the 3S strategy in the EU. But let me now mention 5 reasons for policymakers to really strengthen regional policy in the current context to respond to the question that you put at the beginning. So first, the first very important reason is that you also mentioned is the territorial impact of megatrends within countries. The impact of megatrends like climate change, demographic change, technological change, globalization more broadly, are highly differentiated across regions within countries, and they require targeted policy approach. If I just take the example of climate change, we know the impact of the climate crisis is highly differentiated across regions within countries, and this will only intensify in the coming years and decades, and certain regions and communities will be much more vulnerable to natural disasters, as we saw this summer with the tragic fires in certain Greek regions or the flooding in Western Germany, for example. As the map shows, there is also a huge variation in the level of emissions between regions, and there is a similar huge variation across regions in terms of the number of jobs at risk from the transition to zero net carbon emissions. So I could provide similar example for all the other megatrends, but the key message is really that going more granular in the policy responses is an imperative in that context to tackle the megatrend. Another important reason, the second reason I would mention, is the increased role of subnational governments, which put them at the forefront of the management of these megatrends. There have been very important decentralization trends in the vast majority of OECD countries over the past 50 years, sometimes called the silent revolution. Almost all public policies have been decentralized to one degree or another. And subnational government, just to give you an idea, are now, so subnational government meaning municipalities, regions, etc., are now in charge of almost 60% of public investment in the OECD, 40% of public expenditure. And we found in a recent study that they are in charge of 64% of public investment related to climate objectives in the OECD. So, of course, this has very important implications for national government, multi-level governance, and regional policy. And there is another important trend to highlight. It is the upscale of subnational government and the strengthened role of the region, the intermediate level of the region. And this question of the scale has become a very prominent issue for regional policy. The third reason I would like to mention is the stagnating productivity in OECD countries and regions. It is a major concern in the OECD, in developed countries. Persistently weak productivity growth is a threat and is still poorly explained. But what is clear is that the spatial dimension of this productivity challenge is underestimated. We know that 2/3 of OECD countries have regions where productivity has stagnated or declined for a decade. Productivity growth in remote rural regions have fallen, for example, compared to rural regions close to cities. That's what you can see on the chart on the slide. And a fourth reason, which is actually linked to this one, is the rising territorial divides between metropolitan areas and the rest of the territory in OECD countries, which are creating a discontent and mistrust in government. The disparities within countries, but at a small regional level, so what we call the TL3 level, have almost constantly increased in OECD countries since 2000, reflecting both the increased concentration of economic activities in cities and the difficulties of small and remote regions keeping pace with the national frontier. This increase has been more notable after the 2008 financial crisis, and the gap between urban and rural regions has increased by 3 percentage points since 2008. So these rising spatial inequalities are creating political risk that create instability and challenge our democratic system. Mistrust in government has increased in recent years, and we know there is a strong territorial dimension of this mistrust. Recent academic literature has shown that long-term regional economic performance is a strong driver of trust in government. So the so-called geography of discontent with important urban-rural divides has serious implications for the functioning of our democracies and requires strong place-based policies to target really the region-specific factors behind persistent regional inequalities. And now I would like to turn to my fifth and last point on how the COVID-19 crisis has amplified all of these factors, further strengthening the need for strong regional policy. We know it, the impact of the health and economic crisis has been highly asymmetric within countries, and the crisis has put local and regional government at the forefront. The crisis has highlighted existing structural weaknesses and amplified pre-existing risks, such as disparities in access to healthcare and housing, demographic changes, digital gaps across metropolitan and rural areas, and so a different capacity, for example, to do remote working. The consequences, it has also highlighted the consequences of a decade of under-investment in municipalities and regions and intergovernmental coordination challenges. The crisis has considerably accelerated certain megatrends, such as digitalization, and it has highlighted government increased awareness of the need to use investment to transition to a low carbon economy, which is the #1 priority in many recovery strategies of OECD countries. Further to this, COVID-19 is making us rethink the spatial equilibrium across urban and rural areas and build urban-rural linkages. Now, different scenarios, and the OECD has developed 4 different possible scenarios for the future of regional development. A big exodus from cities is not envisioned, but still the spatial equilibrium is likely to change in the coming years. So to conclude, I just would like to highlight a few final considerations. Looking ahead, strengthening regional policy in the wake of the crisis requires not only rethinking the mix of priorities and objectives, but also rethinking the functioning of our multi-level governance and finance systems. The trade-offs and the weight of the different priorities cannot be decided in a top-down way and need to be differentiated across regions. Regional and local actors are also better placed to identify the priorities of their regions and the complementarities across the different sectoral priorities. Strengthening regional policy also requires having a much more forward-looking and anticipatory policy approach rather than just an ex-post corrective tool. So the projection, for example, for climate change or the demographic change are more important than ever to take into account into the design of regional policy today. So, and just a final word to say that we will shortly launch at the OECD a new regional recovery platform to track the subnational dimensions of the recovery and highlight forward-looking scenarios for regional development. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. I think it's better if we have all the presentations and then we go on with the discussion. The next presentation by Luis Dykstra. He is head of the economic analysis sector in the DG for regional urban policy of the European Commission. He is, of course, in charge of many research projects for the EU and also the main actor behind the cohesion report. But we don't invite him just as an EU representative, we invited him as a scholar. So I give him the floor and ask him for his thoughts.
Thank you, Ugo. I regret we weren't here all together, but I'm glad that we can still share our presentations online. I'm looking to see if I can share my screen. Just give me a second. I need to authorize stuff. Okay, it says I need to quit and reopen Zoom. Just give me a minute. I do apologize.
Okay, we see you again. Can you share the screen?
Now I should be able to share the screen. Yes.
Yes, wonderful.
Oh, sorry about that. Things keep updating at the most inconvenient moments. Okay, so here's my 10 minutes worth of thinking on this topic. It was really interesting to hear both Ugo and Dorothée speaking about this, because we really come from this from very similar angles, and we've seen the changes over the past decades in the thinking. And I think, you'll see a lot of echoes and similarities between these presentations, but I'll try and give you my spin on it. So indeed, if you look at the history of regional policy, there was definitely a focus on disparities and on equity. But increasingly, we have started to think about the responses to asymmetric shocks, and thinking also about public goods and services and changes to demographic change, for example. And then I want to talk a little bit also about the pandemic impacts. Now, I think one of the things that for me has changed is that when you think about regional policy as a policy aimed to eliminate all regional income or productivity disparities, inevitably it becomes a very unrealistic policy, and also clearly a policy that it doesn't really consider efficiency. So there you're really at the heart of the story of an equity efficiency trade-off, whereas I prefer to think of regional policy when it comes to disparities that not all the income and productivity disparities are necessarily efficient, i.e. they can be reduced without reducing aggregate growth. And I'm going to try and talk you through this a little bit. So here you can see GDP per capita at the NUTS 2 level on the right, and the places in green are above the EU average in 2019. And already there you can see some clear patterns. You can see all the capitals, or most of the capitals in some of the large cities, pop out very clearly. You can see Lisbon, you can see Madrid, Dublin, Paris, Berlin, Warsaw, Budapest, Sofia, they all pop out. And there's several reasons for that. I mean, one of the reasons obviously is agglomeration, and the fact that you get more productivity and a concentrated service economy with a lot of highly educated people living nearby. So those are the kind of classic urban agglomeration economies. But you also get an effect of a lot of the headquarters being based in the capital as opposed to the rest of the country. And you get the sectoral mix that also reflects higher in GDP. Traditionally, there's always been a lot of talk of core periphery, this idea that the core has benefits that the periphery misses out. And what I like about this map is even though there seems to be a hint of core periphery, you can see, for example, that in Bulgaria and Romania and Eastern Hungary and Slovakia, it's not doing that well. If you look at the north, northern Sweden, for example, which is really much more remote, say, than Hungary is actually doing really quite well. So the simple idea of core periphery explaining a lot of the disparities we're seeing here doesn't really work. You can see substantial income differences between these regions, but checking my time, sorry. But it doesn't explain a lot. Dorothée showed that indeed remote rural regions struggle more to catch up, but that rural regions close to a city are actually catching up. And so here you can see some of that process, also the consequences of this process, in the sense that Sweden actually has very high productivity in these remote regions, as does, for example, Denmark. Now, one of the other aspects, of course, of what you see here is that productivity often translate in higher wages, but it doesn't factor in the differences in cost of living. And so the differences there may capture some of the benefits that otherwise would accrue to the employees. Now, here's a new graph I did trying to kind of look at disparities in household income, net household income by degree of urbanization. And I've benchmarked them all to the city level. And if you look at the country rankings, you'll see I've ranked them by how much lower is income in rural areas. And then on the far left, you can see in Romania and Bulgaria, it's almost half of what somebody earns in a household earns in a city. But as you move to the right, you'll see more and more developed countries appearing, and the gaps are smaller and sometimes even in favor of rural areas. So clearly, urbanization doesn't explain everything in terms of income differentials. And in the most developed countries, for example, here, Belgium, but also on the far right, UK, rural areas actually have higher average net household income. So it's a key question. Why do more developed countries have smaller gaps? Why is the benefit of urbanization smaller in more developed countries? And I think that's a key question to get back to. Now, asymmetric shocks, you've heard a lot about already. Initially, there was a lot of concern about trade, globalization, but also structural transformation doesn't happen in a space-neutral manner. If we look in Europe, you see that the rural regions, definitely the less developed rural regions, still have a much higher share of their employment in agriculture than other regions do. And so this transformation works its way through the country, slowly seeing reductions of the amount of employment in agriculture, sometimes quite rapidly. And then this employment, this labor, either is relocated to another sector within the region or to another sector elsewhere, maybe leading indeed to a reduction of population in these formerly more agricultural dependent regions, if you will. Sectoral policies, the spatially blind, Ugo mentioned them already, typically ignore the spatial impact of those policies. And so that may or may not have a disproportionately negative or positive effect on some of the regions. And so, think of trade policies, but also think of innovation policies. We know, for example, that Horizon spends a large of its share of its funding in some of the most productive and innovative regions. And so, a neutral policy aimed at the best innovation actually ends out with a very specific spatial impact. And the digital transition and the green transition were already mentioned as places that also, as transition that also have a very strong spatial impact that we shouldn't forget. Like the chart shown by Dorothée on the access to broadband speeds by degree of urbanization. Demographic differences have really become much more debated in the Commission and the Union. We now have a Commissioner for Democracy and Demography, in part inspired by this discussion of the geography of discontent, but also because we're going through a very significant demographic transition. We see the new generations are smaller than the previous generations. We're going to have a shrinking population. We have an aging population. healthy aging population, but nevertheless, the number of people over 65 are going to grow much more rapidly, whereas the working age population is already shrinking, the young people, the number of children is shrinking. So that has implications for the kind of services that you need to provide. And again, none of that is space neutral. Here, I'm showing the discrepancies at NUTS2 level and life expectancy. And you can clearly see that, especially in Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, it's still much lower than the rest of the EU. Anything in this blue-purple is below the EU average. The good news is that these disparities have been shrinking over time. And then the pandemic. One of the reasons we're all sitting behind our little webcams, of course, is the pandemic and the restrictions it put on social gathering and academic gatherings, but also spatially, the impact has been far from neutral. We know that the infection rate, the start of the infections differed between regions. Initially, it was heavily urban focused, but in the second wave, there was a much stronger rural focus of the infections and much faster growth rates there of the infections. And of course, this has put massive strains on local healthcare capacity, highlighting the fact that healthcare has a strong spatial local component in the delivery of its care. And we can't pretend this is purely a spatially blind or a policy. Then, of course, what teleworkability, OECD has done some nice work on that, highlighting that in some places it's easier to work from behind your computer than in other ones. The share of frontline workers, especially tourism sector, has a lot of frontline workers, but because of the restrictions on mobility, tourism sector has been hit heavily, and again, affecting some regions more than others. And the most exposed to the virus were, of course, the elderly. And again, these are concentrated in often in the south or in the rural regions and parts of Germany where that risk is higher purely as a function of the age structure. Now, cognizant of my time, trying to wrap up, I would argue that regional policy initially was too focused on equity and redistribution and not on efficiency. And I actually would argue that, that's my time's up, that regional policy is an investment policy. We're looking at the best investments to take advantage of unused opportunities, unused resources, and we can actually contribute both to a reduction of disparities in productivity and income as to aggregate growth. So I really think that's an important distinction to make. I don't think we should eliminate all disparities. Some disparities are quite inevitable. Typically the most educated concentrated in some of the largest cities with the most research centers and the most universities. That's not necessarily a bad thing. But I think one of the demands that we've seen in the Union is a greater demand for rural proofing and urban proofing, really trying to consider the spatial impacts of various sectoral policies and shocks. And of course, the geography of discontent, also mentioned by both speakers before, highlights the need to really consider the spatial impact, for example, of moving to a zero carbon economy. And then the demographic change. At the global level, at the national level, at the EU level, the changes are slight, but it's really at the regional and local level that you see rapid changes, and exactly those rapid kind of changes need to be managed because it really requires a change in the amount of public services and infrastructure provided. And then lastly, I would say that the pandemic has highlighted how interconnected the world really is and how quickly a virus can spread from China to all over. But that the impacts of that pandemic and the restrictions that we've put in place to kind of restrain it have had a tremendously differentiated impact. And it may sometimes help or affect poor places, and other times it may affect more affluent places. It's still too early to tell, but it's clear that the impacts will be very differentiated. With that, I'd like to thank you.
Thank you very much. So as I said, we are going on with the next presentation. So the next one is by Professor Lisa De Profis. She's Professor of Regional Economic Development in the Birmingham Business School. She's an expert in manufacturing, Industry 4.0, technological change, service clusters, creative industries, regional economic development, and so on. She recently completed an Horizon project on Industry 4.0. And she's also a fellow editor of regional studies. I give you the floor, and you have also 10 minutes, around 10 minutes for your presentation.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this roundtable that really touches on a very, very interesting topic, which is what was the future of regional policy? Especially in the context of what I see two big existential challenges. And I will not talk about COVID in this presentation, but of course it's always in the back of our mind. Now, I see two big challenges taking place at the moment that we're facing. One is technological change and one is climate change. I will focus in particular on the first one because I've been working on this over the last few years. Now, we all know we are in the middle of a technological or an industrial and technological revolution. That implies a number of transformations taking place. So not just simply production transformation or changes in the organization of production, in the nature of industries, but also in the nature of markets. Also, institutions will change with that, or will have to provide different solutions when these transformations are fully deployed. And finally, we as people will do almost everything differently in 20 years' time, probably. So there will be a societal transformation occurring from the way we are as citizens, as consumers, as employees. All that is expected to be changed. Now, we are in the middle of this shock. We're in a transition from those of you who know my work, we're in the middle of this transition. And so we are seeing kind of the disappearing of an obsolete technological paradigm with all the kind of resistance that comes with it. At the same time, we already see the emergence of a new paradigm with a lot of radical innovation coming through. These innovations at the moment are at the stage of being basic knowledge, for example, enabling technologies. And we don't know yet how they will be deployed in different sectors. Firms will explore, experiment, and this will go, and through this, the system will go through an exploration and then finally an adoption and diffusion phase. Now, what is interesting, I'm talking about system, because what we must remember is that this change needs to be seen as a system change. It's not just an industrial change or technological change. And of course, the way in which industry and technologies interact in places is what we're talking about here. So the system change is what we are talking about. Now, what is regional policy? I think regional policy can be broadly, I don't really want to repeat things that have already been said, but very much they've been until now place-based. And they've been really very efficient and effective in tackling incremental change and adjustment. They've been helping places to really adapt to changes and to maintain themselves along a prosperity trajectory. By rebalancing the economies, by introducing some, for example, new services, but overall, the way in which regional policy has been deployed so far, I'm thinking about Ugo's waves, and very much we're thinking that both the disparity wave and the competitiveness wave and the potential waves, all of them were at times where technology was given, was known. There wasn't a significant or disruptive changes we're going through now. Of course, it has to also to reduce interregional disparity. The language of leveling up is very, very present at the moment. But I would say that the micro scale of policy has matched the extent of the intervention and then the extent of the need for intervention. With, for example, education policy, cluster policy were very popular in the 1990s, early 2000s, innovation policy, which means the application of new technologies to existing industries. Now, the way I say it, this place-based regional policy has been very successful. In particular, looking at the European Union, its smart specialization policy have been very good at supporting places in their need to adjust to incremental changes. So to remain competitive at times where they had to change some marginal technologies. My question is, what will change when we are, as we are now, a time of disruptive change, when the change is not just simply tinkering around the corners, but actually it is fundamental change. In my view, what I suggest here, a little bit breaking from the previous two speakers, is that maybe we should think regional policy as being part of a multi-level, multi-system policy strategy. Places cannot be left alone now, because the changes are definitely, for most of the places, the changes are outside their locality. So never leave a place alone now, because I think this will fundamentally undermine the long-term prosperity. On the other hand, they have to be the crossroad of two big policies: technology policy, AI, blockchain, all the one that you have in mind, all of them, we are just at the beginning of understanding what they do. And of course, a lot of basic research is going through in Europe, for example, through Cordis, through the Horizon Europe programs. But at the same time, these technologies are applied to different sectors. So we see industries changing, new industries emerging. So we need to really rethink about a new industrial policy. Now, the intersection between industrial policy and regional policies, this is where I see regional policy flourishing and helping localities. But localities that see themselves constantly connected with other policies. And I know that this triangulation between technology, place, and industry is somehow taken on board within the European Union. We have the European Digital Agenda. European industrial policies are very, very interesting, talking about unicorns, FDIs, MEs, R&D, and so on. The European Digital Agenda really talking about big infrastructural projects that, of course, individual places cannot do by themselves. If we're shifting, for example, to 5G, this is not an investment that can be taken place in the regional level. Equally, I feel, although I'm not really an expert on it, I think some of the big issues of climate change cannot be resolved at the regional level. E-government, e-healthcare, these are big things that really have to take place at a different level. And this is where the multi-level, in my view, multi-level policy comes in. Maybe national level, maybe European level in the case of the European Union. And then, of course, there is regional policy, the heart of European, for example, policy intervention. But when we see, for example, just one of the many charts I picked out of the website, these are investment in jobs and growth goal. As you can see, the red part, the dark red parts are very much signaling to me that still regional policy is addressing a regional disparity. And I completely agree with Lewis that it should be more of an investment, and very much an investment that is intersecting with technology policy and industrial policy. I'm glad that Lewis mentioned the case of Sweden. I have done some work on Sweden, and I really like the way they have already in place this kind of multi-system approach, whereby you have that the technology policies are delivered through the strategic innovation programs, more industrial policy through, just to pick one, Production 2030 scheme. And then you've got the VIMVEX that enable to sow these policies which are defined at the national level in the territory. So the territory is where these policies find somehow an application, but places are not left by themselves. My concern is that the bottom-up approach we've been adopting so far might leave places a bit too isolated from the big changes which are happening elsewhere. We need to imagine different ways, new ways of connecting places to this big change, because most of the places will not be the theater of this technological change, but they have to become locked and engage with these changes. The UK, well, very quickly, if I can say, the UK there is a complete lack of a policy commitment at the moment. There is certainly no regional policy. So I wanted to put a little face with the nod and smile, but I thought it was a bit too cruel. So I just left the green bubble out completely. There's no regional policy. The only industrial policy taking place is this, building back better, but really what is just a document. There is no real actions materializing. And the only technology policy which has been around for a while has been the digital catapults. And these catapults are kind of peppered around the country. very poorly connected with places, very poorly connected with national policy. In my view, I mean, probably worth exploring what has been the impact of these catapults on the innovation of industries and places in the UK. But overall, the absence of regional policy really, for me, is an alarm bell that goes off saying what's happening to places really in the UK, again, many of which are outside the action. So really to wrap up, regional policy needs to be redefined in my way in the context of the current system change. So I'm really talking here about technology, but of course, probably some of the things I'm saying will hold for climate change as well. The need is to integrate and coordinate a regional policy with a technology and industrial policy. To really have this triangulation is very, very important. I don't see this as overlapping. I think what worries me, for example, about the European Union's regional policy is that a lot of is meant to deliver as well climate change and digital. So what you do, you're basically trying to overlap these things with the same money. Now, my concern in doing so, you might just lose sight of the extent of the system change that is required. So I would advocate for an additionality argument, more just simply an overlapping argument, whereby with one funding you do X, Y, and Z. And so it's just basically killing 2 or 3 birds with the same stone. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you very much for your time, and looking forward to questions.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Again, we are having all 5 presentations, and then have a time for answering questions and discussion. So the next presentation is by Professor Robert Huggie. He's the Director of Research and Innovation at the School of Geography and Planning of Cardiff University, as well as being the Director of Cardiff University Cities Research Centre. So he's well known for his studies on competitiveness, knowledge flows, entrepreneurship, innovation clusters, and so on. He's also one of the originator of the European Competitiveness Index. But his presentation now, I think, is mostly based on his recent research on behavioral perspectives on these issues. So I think very innovative one. Floor is yours. You have also 10 minutes, around 10 minutes for your presentation.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to this roundtable as well, Hugo. I want to pick up on some of the issues we've discussed around regional policy already, but maybe to take it back to think about regional theory. And clearly, if we're going to have a good regional policy, I think we need to have some good regional theory. And I want to sort of try to inflect maybe something thinking around from some new thinking around behavioral perspectives and from the role of human behavior and how human behavior differs across regions and how that can maybe impact in terms of development trajectories and also the impact of policy as well. So I say sort of start off really trying to sort of think about regional theory. And if we kick off, I've put up 2 recent contributions, both from Ron Martin, actually, which I found quite useful. One in the Journal of Economic Geography and one in Regional Studies, Regional Science. And in both, really, he's sort of suggesting the way that theory needs to develop if it's going to actually have a positive impact in terms of policy. In the first one, he discusses about some of the pros and cons around pluralistic economic geography theory. And again, you can see both sides in a way, but he argues in a way that it needs to be, and there needs to be more integration across different types of theory particularly if we're going to work towards some better policy, which seems to make good sense to me. And clearly, we've seen sort of multiplication in terms of different terms, different conceptualizations within the fields of economic geography and regional studies, which have impacted in terms of policy. And of course, they've in a way, if we look at some of those waves, we can see that certain waves around different literatures have been important at different points in time. They maybe fell by the wayside, which could really be integrated into a more stronger theory over time. And in the other one, I think in the regional studies, regional science paper, he talks about the role of theory in shaping and transforming policies down the line. So if we're going to have a role as scholars or as academics in terms of thinking about setting agendas in terms of policy, we need to think about how transformative our own thinking is, particularly our own theoretical and conceptualizations. So where are we at in terms of regional development? Well, clearly there's a range of different concepts and theories we could draw upon. I'm just going to highlight three. Start off with what we might call the endogenous capital accumulation theory, which really is the mainstay, is what we largely talk around, regional development theory, which is what we've been talking about already in this session and with other sessions across the conference, thinking about the allocation, organization of capital, industries and firms, and how that can be maybe more efficient and or work towards better equity, which again, as I would say, would seem to be the mainstay. Over the last 10 years or so, we can see the emergence of theories more around institutions, both formal and informal, and in particularly the types of institutions, the development at which stage they're at, and their overall efficiency. So again, thinking of informal and formal, economic, social, and political. We've seen some of the work again coming from the Commission around the quality of governance, etc. And then we've seen some other work around more informal, around thinking about institutional values, etc. And to me, it seems to be useful and possible to actually link together some of the capital accumulation theory with the institutional theory. You're not going to have good use of resources in terms of if you're not going to have those good institutions, which others are saying as well. And then I'd highlight that maybe a third, a relatively nascent theory, try to think about the role of human behavior, and how human behavior and human agency are actually some of these deep-rooted causes of differences in economic development across regions. Because in a way, human behavior was sort of maybe set agendas in terms of the types of institutions, and again, the way in which resources and capital are actually utilized within particular regions. So try to think about some of these differences in human behavior at aggregate level across regions, and how that can maybe inform policy down the line. I've been given some thinking around this with my colleague Piers Thompson. We just published this book earlier on in this year, Behavioral Theory of Economic Development. And within that, we try to highlight the fact that we understand systems is very important. We've discussed some systems this afternoon, and networks and connections, be it between organizations, between agents and human agents at different levels, and will all have an impact in terms of development and the ability to actually create new development paths. But within that, the role of agents, and particularly the role of human agents, and which types of agents exist within particular regions, which can push the development of certain types of networks, systems, and therefore down the line, overall economic development. And we see this sort of link between some of this sort of more structural areas, which again links back to some of the capital accumulation theory, with some of this more thinking about agentic and the role of agency within regional development. And then within the book, we begin to discuss what might exist in terms of regions that are maybe locked into some sort of positive trajectories, which we've seen some of that maybe around some of the capital cities, etc. We've seen in some of the other non-rural regions, and maybe some of those negative lock-in regions, which are not always peripheral, but again, often don't have some of the capacity to actually develop these and create these new development paths. We start off at the bottom, going back to some institutional theory, the differences maybe between wealth creating theories and more rent seeking institutions, which we give some examples maybe we should find in weaker, less developed regions. We think about the role of culture and the way culture actually changes in a positive way, or maybe reproduces itself in a more negative way that actually hinders development. And then again, thinking about the role of agents and the way agents within particular regions may actually constrain institutional change or positive cultural change within particular regions. And we try to sort of outline some examples around that. And what we've done in terms of the agencies. We've drawn on some of the psychological literature which discuss around 3 types of human agency: personal agency, what you do yourself; collective agency, working through groups, particularly in terms of networks; and then proxy agency, where you may try to get someone else to do something which achieve maybe some positive ends along the way. There could be a number of different ways you could think about the types of agency, and there's a range of literature around that. We've done it around 3, thinking about the role of entrepreneurships, of entrepreneurs, thinking about political agencies, drawing some of this growing literature around leadership, etc., and then drawing on some of the human geography literature around labor agency and the role of workers, etc. And again, we discuss some of the roles of these particular types of agents in either sort of promoting or hindering development down the line. And then what we argue, I suppose, is the center of the book in a way. Where does this different types of agency, where does it emerge, and why does it emerge differently in different types of regions? And we draw on 2 literatures in a way. We draw on, which some others have done now, thinking about personality psychology, and the way that you can maybe have different traits found maybe more or less within particular regions. And we draw on the big 5 around openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, or emotional stability. And then we draw on our own framework around regional and local community culture. We've sort of, some of it we take from some of the work at a national level around Hofstede, around thinking about collective action, involvement in risky activities, different things to try to understand the different types of human behavior and the way we can actually conceptualize it. I mean, we put the 2 together to make this argument around the sort of the psychoculture of places. And then since the book, we've taken it a bit further. We've got a paper just coming out in economic geography, and we try to think about the behavioral profile of a place from both the personality psychology perspective and also from a cultural perspective. And we put together 2 different types of profiles. One we call a conscientious, open, extrovert, or co-personality profile. And we hypothesize that type of personality profile in a regional locality may actually push productivity. And from a cultural perspective, we say a place where people are engaged in work, education, etc., more diversity, but also maybe individualistic in that their thinking may again also push forwards higher levels of productivity. So we put together some metrics to measure this. We do it just for local authority areas within England. And we found, you can see from the maps maybe, that we do find significant difference across different localities within England. And we do some analysis against with productivity as dependent variable, and we find unsurprisingly we find some interesting and positive relationships. And what we argue from that work in thinking about regional policy is that, yes, we understand that we need to take on board what comes from the mainstay of regional policy, going back to that capital accumulation and also the role of institutions as well. But maybe to think about some of the differences in different types of behavior, what may work or may not work. Again, just trying to invest in a certain area which has worked in one region may not work in another region because you have a completely different behavioral profile in a way. And we argue in this paper that a lot of public investments, which again, everyone's talking about the term investments today, we do the same as well in terms of regional policy. They will continue to underperform if we don't take account of the different behavioral profile. And we've seen this over time where people have argued you can't just copy and paste different types of policies. Because they often won't work. And why don't they work? It's mainly because actually maybe no account has been taken of whether there would be any buy-in by actually the citizens and people living in those regions and locations. Now, is there any evidence around that? I've just started, I haven't published this, but I'm working on it. I've just been looking at some of the literature, just the academic literature. And the more you sort of go into the literature, you can see there are a number of examples where there's particular regions have taken a more integrated approach, and one where they've actually paid some due to the behavioral profile of the region. I'm sure there's probably other literature coming from the great literature and the policy literature as well. These are just some examples I've come across. I'm trying to integrate into my own work, which seems to be, in a way, they're exceptions, but have shown that actually there can be positive developments, thinking from a more integrative perspective. So just to round up, again, a bit like Lisa, I haven't really focused on COVID. Clearly, we seem to be seeing more and more shocks, going back to the financial crisis in 2008, up until COVID now. It does seem to be that we're working within a relatively volatile macroeconomic environment. To me, it seems to be behavioral is very important. We know so much more around behavior in a way in terms of at an aggregate regional, local level from COVID, and some of the research been undertaken within that. And it would seem to be this building together, thinking around what can happen in terms of behavioral change at the local or regional level, and what is going to come from exogenous events such as COVID over time, and how regions can actually react and determine their fortune. It does seem to be a tall order for many regions to actually beat the odds and to move on to some other new phases of economic growth and development. Does that mean nothing should be done? Certainly not. Some of the literature I was reading, and I highlighted some of those earlier, shows that positive change can come. But again, these seem to be the exceptions. And I think perhaps we need to look at these exceptions and to think about not just trying to imitate or mimic what can happen elsewhere, but think about the processes and the links between the different types of levels in terms of the behavior, the institutions, and the availability of particular resources. So I shall leave it there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Very interesting presentation. So before the last presentation, I'd like to invite the audience to start writing your own questions in the chat, so that when the last presentation is finished, they are already there for the speakers to reply. Okay. So the last presentation is by Sami Moizio. He's a professor of spatial planning and policy in the Department of Geosciences and Geography at the University of Helsinki. His research interests includes state spatial transformation, political geography of economic geographies, and urban political geography. Most notably, a recent book, which is Geopolitics of the Knowledge-Based Economy, won the Regional Studies Association Routledge Best Book Award in 2019. Very appealing title. I leave the floor to you, and again, around 10 minutes for your presentation.
Okay, many thanks, Ugo, for the kind introduction. And my presentation will be about political and intellectual justifications for regional policies. And if I can change these slides. I would like to start my presentation with this picture dealing with the different dimensions of regional policies, and I would like to highlight the fact that that regional policies are associated with all these dimensions. It is something that has to do with uneven geographical development, which is the material, social relations type of thing, and the fact that capitalism is based on regional disparities as well. It's about spatial imaginaries, about as was mentioned already, our theories shape policies, and therefore it is important to also to understand the discursive power of academic theories in shaping regional policies, and also all kinds of other spatial imaginaries influence regional policies. If you think about, for instance, the concept of polycentric development, you immediately recognize that it's a spatial imaginary that has some sort of influence in regional policies. But also, finally, this collective politics of in the context of regional policies is very important. So, regional policies also work at the level of political experience, which is very important to realize when we talk about politics of regional. The politics of regional development. So why regional policies? So we quite often start to think about the post-World War II context and the golden age of regional policies when we mentioned this concept. And of course, the justifications then were very broad, so to speak. It was about national consolidation around the nation state. It was the sovereignty, territory, citizenship axis. It was about the prevention of the rise of political radicalism in different national contexts. It was about economic growth through utilizing all these resources, both natural and human resources, throughout state territories. So this narrow understanding of the economy. And these three together, I believe, formed a sort of interesting economic dimension, strategic economic dimension of political communities back then. So the so-called Keynesian Fordist era. So this spatial Keynesianism was based on a sort of national compromise between organized labor, the state apparatus, and corporate capital. And I think it was very important to realize this, so that the massive spatial redistribution stemmed from this interesting compromise. And that was back then the major justification or the idea behind regional policies. I don't have time to go into the Finnish experience, but I just want to mention something about the more contemporary context. And we know that the spatial Keynesianism has been gradually replaced by new kinds of political strategic thinking, and which is very much based on economic theorizing. And it is often called the post-Fordist mode of accumulation, which has been emerging since the 1980s, and it's an interesting context. And of course, there has been also some changes during the past 30 years or 40 years or so. But I think it is very important to recognize that this has been a context where some very important changes have taken place. And one of those has been that the security political justifications, the sovereignty, citizenship, and security nexus has largely disappeared. And this has been the era when financialization, knowledge-based economization, neoliberalism they have together formed a sort of interesting context within which the justifications for regional policies have also changed. And this was very visible already in the 1990s, as has been already said. The kind of the innovation term or competitiveness turn back then, and the all-embracing innovation and technology talk that just began to characterize also regional policies across different geographical contexts. So it's very interesting to recognize that this contemporary context still is characterized by what Neil Brenner calls endemic tension between the drive to equalize capital investments across space and the pressure to differentiate such investment in order to exploit place and territory specific conditions for accumulation. So this is the broad, I believe we still live within such a framework. So why regional policies today? I tried to search a little bit how regional policies across different contexts, how these are today justified in political action by politicians and state officials and people like that, also in the EU context. And I think it is interesting to recognize that there are some features or some aspects which we inherit from the spatial Keynesian context, and there are also some more recent justifications as well. The major one seems to be, or one of the most important seems to be, to balance two types of spatial development: the metropolitanization to balance between metropolitanization and peripheralization, so that this still remains one of the major justifications. Also, we increasingly hear increasingly hear arguments regarding how regional policies should be, echoing the 1990s context, how regional policies should be more about investing than tackling spatial disparities through the redistribution. And this is also very important in the context of regional theory, how academics are also speculating on this issue quite a bit nowadays and discussing this quite a bit. And it has its impact on regional policies sooner or later, I believe. Also, there are arguments to continue redistributing economic assets and services across space because it is considered very important in the age of rising territorial divides and these rising spatial disparities, growing spatial disparities. And quite often nowadays, also in the context of the European Union, people are discussing these, politicians, people like that, how this is important to tackle sort of undesirable political implications, how this has something to do with the geography of discontent. And this is also very important, as it's also discussed in terms of global environmental change and these all kinds of crises that is underway as we speak, and these undesirable political implications are seen as emerging out of this context, which is characterized by increasing spatial polarization. In our one EU project, what we have been it's called Imagine EU project, EU Horizon 2020 project, we have been also discussing whether it would be important to have new, let's say, intellectual justifications for regional policies, not only in the context of the European Union, but also in different national contexts. And we have been trying to somehow reconceptualize this by using the notion of spatial justice. Spatial justice very often discussed in the context of cities and urban spaces, but we also want to regionalize it in order to point out that this has something to do, regional policies can be also rethought through different dimensions such as capacities. This is a bit like the potential of places perspective, place-based approach, a bit revised, if you like. So we should probably rethink the capacity dimension of regional dimensions, also how certain type of governance structures enhance or allow place-based development and particular type of spatial justice to take place, and how also we should probably think about the substantive goals of policies as well. And these, I don't have time to go through these as we speak, but this is only one example how we as scholars should also rethink the justifications for regional policies from different intellectual perspectives. And finally, I would like to just mention something which is back to basics and remind all of us that there is a spatial democratic dimension of regional policy, which is about identities and territorial manifestation of identities under globalization. It's about regional policies contribute to collective experiences regarding inclusions or exclusions, and as well as our subjective perceptions of people about winners, winning regions and losing regions. And it's important, therefore, also to ask what values are incorporated within regional policies as democracy, diversity, economic efficiency, and competitiveness, etc., may also clash. And finally, what are what kind of regional policies at the age of possible post-COVID-19 wave of austerity politics, which is behind the corner perhaps, and all these, I believe, are important to when we say yes, we still need regional policies, and it is also high time to rethink the kind of intellectual justifications for for regional policies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So we have not a lot of time actually, but very nice questions in the chat. So I will read a few of them. I'm sorry if anything will not. Okay, things which are may have been mentioned, and then I leave you for very quick replies from each other. Okay, one from Stefan Vetsen. Speaks about the big elephant in the room. We don't hear about change capacity of policy. Okay, so the issue of capacity effect is have been left out of this discussion. I don't think because it's not important, just because it's more regarding the implementation. But you may say. So yes, okay, there is the other the specification. I refer to the actual capacity to shape development outcomes in the midst of powerful financial markets, more than seeking a speculative investments around the scissor effect of more work and less resources, and not least the complexity of many structural changes. So that's one. Second question by Dimitris Korpakis. You all seem to advocate a new synthesis and a new integration among policies towards a new regional policy. Yet, at the level of the EU, we see time and again a multiplication of parallel policies that do not really talk and relate to each other, so zero policies. How do you think we can break the barrier across policies and reinvent regional policy at the level of the EU? A good example is the smart specialization, where the only application space is regional policy, whether all the rest of policies seem to forget or just referring to it in a cursory manner. Okay, and then very closely related, the question by Roberta Capello, because she asked about how do you see the relationship between the new generation EU plan and regional structural funds? So are they complements or substitutes? So again, the integration of policies. Okay, yes, these are okay. Yeah, question coming now, but I think I'll be stopping with this. Teresa Lekova, there are emerging debates about mission-oriented innovation policies. Moreover, mission-oriented is used in Horizon Europe. Do you think this could be the right framework in regional context? And finally, from Marco Bellandi, and especially to Lisa De Propris, is it possible to say that an effective multi-level and cross-sectional governance need a national innovation system that is consciously as a policy-making system? But of course, the leading policymakers based in capital cities can be against such an interpretation. Okay, so I think I stop here and give the floor. I think we start with Lisa, since she's been called upon by the last question. But if you can just provide hints, because the line will be cut off at 4 o'clock.
Okay, well, thank you very much for all the questions. I think specifically to the one that Mark was asking, I think we do need to see a better connection between national innovation system with regional innovation system. So somehow an intersection between these different levels, also in the presence of industrial systems. So these three systems have to be better coordinated. That's all. I'll leave it to this. Thank you.
Okay. So who wants to address the issue of policy integration or capacities? Maybe I can jump in here. Yes.
Just a word thanks for the very interesting questions and comments. On this question of policy capacity, I think you're right. It's a very good point. I mean, it's often one of the most important bottlenecks on the implementation side. We know that regional policy has become one of the most an extremely complex policy. It has to be differentiated. It's multi-level. It implies multiple actors, public, private, etc. All responsibilities are shared, so it's very difficult to have a clear picture of who does what. but it makes it even more important to invest on this question of governance, and in particular at the subnational level. We have done, there are empirical studies showing the relationship between the good governance at the regional level and the outcomes of public investment. And and also with the productivity outcomes. So the quality of governance, not only at the national, but at the subnational level, should be a key focus of our attention. So it means focusing on the scale for the question of economies of scales, but also the size of the workforce, the quality of the workforce, etc. So all these issues are probably a bit underestimated in the debates indeed. So stopping there.
Thank you. Lewis, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on Roberta's question about next generation EU and how that relates to cohesion policy. I don't think they're substitutes. To answer your question, whether they are complements or substitutes. I mean, the next generation EU is really intended to do two things. Really give a big jolt to the recovery that we need now post-pandemic, and secondly, really put us as far as possible, ahead in terms of digital and the green transition. And I see a lot of actions there that would have taken a lot longer to fund through cohesion policy. And we see funding there going to countries which traditionally don't necessarily receive that much funding, right? There's money going to the Nordics, to Belgium, to the Netherlands, not traditionally big recipients of cohesion policy. So I think they're complements. They're trying to achieve different things. And cohesion policy is still there as a long-term investment policy, primarily dedicated to the less developed policies. And I wanted to respond to Lisbeth de Schutter as well. She asked, can we, what values do we want in regional policy? A certain living standard for all, above which it can be unequal, or a certain living standard for all, period. I'm a fan of philosophy, and one philosopher came up with the term incommensurability. It means things you cannot compare. And quality of life in different places for me are to a large degree incommensurable. How should I compare living next to an opera to looking at a gorgeous view of a rural landscape? I mean, these things are very difficult to compare. So I don't think we can come up with a single definition of what quality of life should be and how we can make sure that everyone can reach that. But I do think we need to think of asking people what constitutes a high quality of life, and what can we do to help them achieve that quality of life. Noticing, knowing, of course, that there are constraints in our capacity to provide the necessary investments to reach that, but a better understanding of what people desire in different places and what we can do to help them fulfill those goals is an important aspect of regional policy. But definitely within the context that we're not going to be aiming for the same type of thing everywhere. I'll stop there.
Thank you. So we have a couple of minutes. So maybe Sami and Robert, do you want to have a bottom sentence from you? You want to add something, your reply to any of the questions?
I just think, building on what Lewis said, really, and thinking about what is the way that quality of life varies across places. When the private sector make investments, big investments in different places, they take it from a different perspective and understanding about what people want in terms of different human behaviors. And I think we can look at the private sector more, I think, to understand how we can make the best investment decisions down the line, and to learn something from there.
Yeah.
Yes, I just want to mention that when it comes to these values, that the regional policies are not primarily about developing economy. They are about developing political communities, and therefore I think it's very, very important to diversify also theories that influence regional policies, academic theories. Also, I think it is very important, at least it has been already in the Finnish context, to discuss the difference, for instance, between objective well-being and subjective well-being, and how these are can be also taken into account when we are formulating regional policies. And this is only one example. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We have 5. Okay, we were given 5 additional minutes. Okay, just now. Yes. Okay. Just discovered. Okay, we will have 5 additional minutes. So, do you want to have another short round of replies?
I felt like we had done so well, finishing on the dot, but well, given the 5 minutes, let me try and reply to one more question. There was a question about, silos and the different EU policies and how they connect to each other. I don't think there is a good answer to that. Inevitably, some policies are going to be extremely specialized and focused, and they're going to be sector specific, and they're going to be in a silo. And in some cases, it is important to connect across silos, but you don't want to end up with one single policy that does everything at all different levels, right? There is a need for, to some degree, maintaining some of the silos. I do think that with cohesion policy, we try and pick up, for example, some of the proposals that were sent to Horizon, but who couldn't be funded, but were nevertheless considered of a high quality. So, there's some interaction there. I don't think we necessarily need to combine all policies, but I am quite wary of a high fragmentation of policies as well. I mean, you don't want to have 100 different policies at the EU, because otherwise you lose it. And already we see that local authorities and regional authorities get a little bit lost in the forest that we create with the different funds and the different policies. So I am in support of somewhat streamlining and harmonizing some of the funds and trying to align them. It'd be better to have a single investment fund, is my private opinion, not the Commission's opinion, rather than having ERDF, Cohesion Fund, and ESF. But these things take a lot of time.
Sorry, Elisa, the properties.
Yes, thank you. I think I'll just take this chance as well, like Luis. I thought the question by Teresa was quite interesting in terms of, we've been talking recently about the mission-oriented innovation. They seem to be the new good thing. Are they still the new good thing, having mission-oriented innovation policies? I don't really know, because the fact depends on the mission, and this is my kind of the underlying concern that I have. If the mission is very narrow, I think we are barking at the wrong tree. If we look at what our European competitors are doing, Asia or the US, they are increasingly investing in big things, a lot of money at the national level in big missions. And I think in a sense, as unfair this might be, because of course the European Union has always had this important attention to fairness and equity, at the same time, at this point in time, not having that level of investment in specific or many technologies, I think might really undermine the future. So the long sight and the short sightedness here plays a very important role. So my answer to that would be, it depends on the mission. The mission has to be really the moon. We're talking about big missions, not just simply something much, much narrower. Thank you.
Thank you. Any more replies? Okay. Okay, so I think we can stop here. Okay, I would like to thank all the speakers for accepting the invitation to participate to this roundtable and for sharing with us their thoughts. I think that this session will also be available in the next days for those who connected later, or who had to leave earlier. So thank you also to ERSA and to EURAC for hosting us today, and I think it's a very worthwhile discussion. We will certainly continue it later and possibly in writing somewhere. Okay, so thank you everybody. I think we can also stop the recording now, and good afternoon to everybody.
Bye-bye.